Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Video Fish Revive podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor James Tabor, and today we're going to be discussing what did Paul believe about the resurrection of Jesus, and what did his opponents believe about Jesus. Welcome back to the show, James. I'm really glad to have you here.
Good to be with you always, Jacob. I enjoy doing shows with you.
Likewise. But yeah, let's get right into it. So what did Paul believe about the resurrection, and what did his opponents think about Jesus? Did they also believe that he rose from the dead in some way? Did Paul and his opponents believe in the same kind of resurrection, two different kinds of resurrection? What's happening there?
So the real question is sources. And Paul, this is shocking, but get ready. Paul is our only firsthand witness of the resurrection of Jesus. That is, we don't have anybody in the New Testament talking about Jesus' resurrection that says in the first person, I saw the Lord, 1 Corinthians 9, or last of all, he appeared to me. So that's just absolutely fundamental. And it's interesting, whenever people talk about the resurrection, they go to the Gospels first, and you should go to the Gospels last. And even if they go to the Gospels, too often they're going to go to Matthew because it's everybody's favorite book, I guess, because it's first. Or they're going to go to Luke, who has Jesus appear, I think once on Sunday, and then later, a week later, and John has him appearing and so forth. And Mark, of course, doesn't have appearances in his original ending, but those are all secondary. There's nobody writing those who says, I was there, I saw it. And Paul wasn't there, meaning at an empty tomb, but he does say, I've seen the Lord. And then he does describe to us in two passages what that might have entailed. So two places he says, I've seen the Lord, 1 Corinthians 9, and I would add Galatians, last of all, he revealed his son in me. I'm quoting it wrong, but he says he was set apart for the gospel, Galatians 1, and that when it pleased God to reveal his son in me or to me. If you go with to me, that could be a third. But as far as just an absolute unambiguous statement, I've seen the Lord, that would be 1 Corinthians 9. And then last of all, he appeared to me. Now, the last of all, though, is important because Paul lines himself up with other witnesses that he says he has received testimony from. And what he, as you know, it's 1 Corinthians 15, he breaks it down. He talks about he appeared to Peter and to the 12 and to all the apostles and to James. We have no record of James. Now, in the Ebionite materials, the Hebrew gospel materials that you studied, I know, he does appear to James. And James is actually at the Last Supper, and I present that in my book, The Jesus Dynasty. So if you put it all together, Paul is aware of an appearance to James, and then a mass appearance, almost like you'd think of maybe these Marian ology appearances of Our Lady or something. 500 brethren at once saw him. He knows about that. We have no record of that otherwise. So if you go with our earliest witness, and we could probably date that, very close to the 50s. So let's say 54, 55 CE. That's within 20, 25 years of Jesus's death if he was crucified in 30, which is a good working date to go with. So 20, 25 years later, Paul says, I saw him, or he appeared to me. Literally, the verb is was seen. It's the aorist passive. He was seen by me. He appeared to me. So I like to call it sightings because, when you cite something, I don't want to trivialize it, but, when people say, and people will think I'm being lighthearted here, but, Elvis was seen in the local grocery store. It actually, And then somebody says, well, there have been 5 other sightings of Elvis in Memphis over the past 5 years, and these people swear they saw him. Well, there's, it's not comparable at all, but I'm trying to get the idea of like a sighting, or he was seen, or he appeared, some sort of manifestation of Jesus. Now, this would be 25 years after. But then when you ask him, as his Corinthian correspondents do indirectly, because he's gotten their questions. And one of their questions is, do you have to believe in resurrection? He goes, absolutely. If you're a Christian, you believe in not only that Christ was raised, that Jesus Christ, but that at his coming, those who belong to him will also be raised. Next question. Well, what do you mean raised? Bodies are decayed, bodies are corrupt, people are lost at sea. What kind of a body are you talking about? And he basically says what nobody wants to talk about. He says, God knows. God knows. So you have to ask, what did he actually see? Because if he saw something, he could say, well, I saw this person, 5'5" to 6 feet tall, and he was shining and he had a white robe. I mean, we have descriptions like that. They're called epiphanies all the way through the Hebrew Bible. The book of Daniel's famous for these. I saw an angel and he was clothed like the sun and he had these garments. He doesn't say that. He doesn't report it as what we would tend to call an epiphany, right? And so when he does this, you have to wonder, why does he not describe the body? So I think what we can say, if we're trying to be really careful here, is we can say that Paul does not report seeing a physical body, because he addresses the question of what kind of body. And if you go to Philippians 3, 20 and 21, 19, 20, 21, I'm not going to turn to these, but that's basically the verses. He does refer to his body, calls it a body. And he says that when Christ appears, the whole thing is our commonwealth, or our government is in heaven, from which we await a Savior, Christ the Lord. And when he appears, he will transform our lowly body, this body of flesh and blood, to be like his glorious body. So whatever Paul saw, it was a glorious body. It would be, in the book of Acts, it's a blinding light. Now, I want to stay with Paul's own testimony in this interview, but it is interesting that the book of Acts presents it like that. Remember, in the book of Acts, when Stephen is martyred, he sees a figure standing at the right hand of God in heaven that he refers to as Jesus, that supposedly is like a human figure, because he says, I see Jesus at the right hand of God. And so that, I think, isn't he the one that says, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit? So this is a different thing. Paul doesn't say that. Paul says that I can't describe the body other than characterize it as glorious, powerful, immortal, no longer of dust, not flesh and blood, but immortal and glorious. So it reminds you of many of the Hellenistic accounts that we have, in which we have a person disappearing. I think Romulus is one of the best known. I think it's Ovid that talks about this in the passage I'm thinking of, where Romulus is giving a discourse to his Roman citizens in Rome on one of the hills, and he begins to rise up and then slowly disappear. And it says his body melts away as he rises. And so Paul apparently has something like that in mind for resurrection. That's in sharp contrast to what we have in the Gospels, where it is a flesh and blood body. So here we have to distinguish, and we have to talk about, what does the word resurrection really mean? In other words, literally resurrection in Greek is anastasis, to stand up. So when you're dead, you're down, right? Lying down in a grave. And when you stand up, you're standing up. It's the revival of a corpse. And that's the normal meaning of resurrection, to stand up or to raise up, agero in Greek. For example, in the Gospels, when Mary Magdalene and the women come to the tomb and they're told by the angel, he's not here, he's been raised up, meaning lifted up, he's gotten up. That idea is not really what Paul calls resurrection. What Paul calls resurrection, I would call more transformation from a lowly, fleshly, mortal, decaying, let's go further, stinking, rotting, corruptible, aging body that is going to lead you to death, to a glorious body that is immortal and is no longer dust. So his big analogy is Adam. He says the first Adam was of the dust, right? Perishable. But the second Adam, he says, is a life-giving spirit. Now, various academics get into arguments and discussions about, but do you need the physical body in order to transform it into the spiritual state? And what they want to do is kind of hold on to the physical. Like the bones, let's say the bones of Jesus were found, that the bones of Jesus matter. And they want to hold on to the physical and say, well, yes, he was transformed, but it's that physical body that was transformed. Well, for Paul, that would only be true of people living at the time. Think about it. Jesus returns in the clouds of heaven. It's very literal. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4. Very literal. And the dead are raised incorruptible, and the living are transformed. Well, if the dead are raised incorruptible, it doesn't mean they come out corruptible first, like some sort of people call it a zombie apocalypse or something, half skeletal remains or something like that. That's not his idea. And in the book of Revelation, the people who are lost at sea, says the oceans give up the dead that are in them. You're not talking about a physical body anymore. So Paul's view of resurrection has nothing to do with the physical body. Doesn't depend on the physical body. I don't even think it involves the physical body. Now, there is a case that he covers that if I was a flesh and blood living human being, not dead, but living, so this wouldn't be resurrection because I'm not dead. And Jesus returns in the blink of an eye, he says, the twinkling of an eye, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we, because he thinks he's going to be alive, and we, the living, will be transformed. He didn't say resurrected. It says transformed, right? From the physical body of dust to the heavenly body of the spirit. And he calls it a life-giving spirit. So the first Adam was dust, second Adam is a life-giving spirit. So for Jesus to come out of the tomb, you know how all Orthodox Christians, Evangelical Christians, the most important thing to them is to show that a physical corpse got revived and came out of the tomb and then ate with people, and they touched his wounds and they saw him. For Paul, that would not be particularly impressive. It would indicate maybe some kind of a miracle that God could revive the dead, make live the dead, but they're not in an immortal state at that point. They're flesh and blood. And Jesus says that. He said, look, I'm not a ghost. I'm not a spirit. I have flesh and bones. So what you've got is two views. One view is what most Christians think is the view, and there's no witness to it whatsoever, that resurrection means a corpse is in a tomb, and on the morning of the third day, the tomb's empty, and that corpse is walking around Jerusalem, showing himself to people. And that's not actually resurrection as Paul understands it. because resurrection is transformation. That would be my motto to leave with you. Resurrection is transformation. It's being transformed from the physical sphere of existence, the mortal sphere, to the immortal. So that would be the main presentation I would give on Paul. And I would argue, Jacob, that that is probably the earliest Christian view. That actually, because it's our earliest we have, and it's the only one we have that's first person. And I think if he thought otherwise, he would have said, I've seen the Lord in his glorified state. But he doesn't say that. He says, I've seen the Lord. And then he equates what the others saw to that. So I'm going to read backwards. I'm going to stay with Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. I'm not going to go to the Gospels, which I think are derivative and later. When you're talking about proving it, like how are we going to prove it? We need a corpse to come out of a tomb and breathe and live and show the wounds. Otherwise, it could be a ghost, or maybe somebody just hallucinated or imagined. Paul's not worried about that. He believes that what he saw is so real that there's no doubt about it. So if you read backwards from our only witness, he says he appeared first to Peter. Now he uses the same term as last of all, he appeared to me. So why should I assume that he appeared as a corpse resuscitated for Peter, but for Paul, it's a transformed being into this heavenly state, immortal, glorious, and powerful. I'm going to read it straight through. Peter also must have seen a glorified Jesus who's been taken away, translated, what we call apotheosis in Hellenistic religions. So I think the earliest views of Christian resurrection, Paul being our only first-person witness, were apotheosis. And if you say, as Celsus later did, well, that could have just been a ghost. It could have been. But these testimonies of these people are that, no, we saw him. We literally saw him in a way that was powerful and amazing, just as people saw angels and so forth. Now, one other evidence of that is embedded in the Gospel of Luke. When Jesus is asked in the Gospel of Luke, it's also in Mark, but Luke has a fuller account. And the reason I'm using Luke is Mark doesn't have appearances, but Luke does. So let's go to Luke and let him tell us what resurrection is like. And according to Luke, when Jesus is asked about a woman with 7 husbands, because they keep dying, right? Remember that? It's like a Sadducee question. They don't believe in resurrection. So what if a woman had 7 husbands and the first one died, and then the second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way to 7? Whose wife will she be in the resurrection because there were 7 men married to her? I mean, so it's one of these crazy hypotheticals people always give when they want to argue religion. You know, like, I'm a pacifist. Oh, really? You're a pacifist? Well, what if someone broke in your house and tied your family up and was torturing them, and you had a gun in your hand, and are you telling me you wouldn't shoot them? You know, it's that kind of thing. So it's basically saying, resurrection's stupid. It's crazy. Who could believe it? Because obviously this woman had 7 husbands, and you can't bring all these people back. It just doesn't make sense. So they didn't believe in resurrection. This was the Sadducees. But what did Jesus answer according to Luke? He says, you err not knowing the scriptures. And then he talks about how God is the God of the living, not the dead. Not the dead. Because all live to him. So it's not like souls living in paradise or afterlife or something like that, as much as they're in the keeping of God. And then he says, in the age to come, those who are worthy to obtain the resurrection will be like angels. They won't marry, they won't give in marriage, neither will they die anymore. So Luke actually has that idea of the resurrection, of being a transformed being, that he likens to some sort of angelic existence, but really higher than angels. Paul shares that view. Paul says to the Corinthians, same letter, 1st Corinthians 6, when they're having their law disputes going to court against each other, he says, I'm ashamed of you. Don't you know that the saints will judge the world? Don't you know that we will judge angels? Well, obviously, you're not going to judge angels in a physical body or if you're dead. So I think we've got to start with Paul, and he's very clear it's a transformed body. So, however, here's the thing. Paul mentions the tomb. He mentions the tomb because he says he was buried. Now, this is the earliest testimony we have of what happened to Jesus when he died. I don't think this is ever pointed out, hardly ever. I never hear it. Everybody's empty tomb, empty tomb. Mark has an empty tomb. Matthew, Luke, John. That's a late tradition, empty tomb. No, it's not a late tradition. The empty tomb is, but not the tomb. The idea of Jesus being buried. What Paul says is he died and he was buried and he was lifted up the third day. Lifted up the way I just explained, meaning in this transformed state. And he actually tells you what that'll be like in 2nd Corinthians 5. And here's what he says. He says, we are dwelling in a tent, like a tent, temporary, and later we're going to dwell in a building. Building is permanent. And he says, if we get rid of the tent, that's when you die, your body goes back to the dust. You don't need that body. You're tentless, but you're also homeless. You don't have your house yet. And then he switches to clothing, old clothes, new clothes. So he says, we're clothed in the body. This is the image of Plato, really. We live in the old clothing of the body. Like I touched my body here. This is my soul, or my inner self is not the body. The body decays, the body perishes. It's not important. It's never coming back. It's of no consequence. It's dust. Adam is dust. Jesus is dust. But the life-giving spirit that emerges, he says, is reclothed, or literally further clothed. And then he adds, this is what everybody misses, we do not want to be found naked. So when you take off your clothes, you're naked. You're dead. Your soul is in the keeping of God. And he goes, well, that's not what we want. We don't want to be naked with God. He's using a metaphor, of course. Old clothing body, lose the body, you're naked, meaning nobody. Reclothed, new body. So those are his analogies. So if you draw that all together, would Paul think that the tomb was empty? I would say no. I would say that he would have no interest in a tomb, of any tomb. What if someone in the Corinthian community had died and was buried? And apparently they had, because they're asking him at Corinth, what's going to happen to some of these people in our group that have died? Right? Well, they're in their tombs. Does Paul say, well, go out to the tomb and wait at the entrance, and if Christ comes, they'll walk out? That isn't what he says. He says the dead will be raised incorruptible. Well, if they're raised incorruptible, you don't take bones and rotten flesh and finally dust to heaven. Or if somebody's lost at sea, you don't have to go find their body parts. So this whole idea of mixing the physical with the transformed body of the resurrection, and by the physical, I realize in the Hellenistic world, it's not our category of physical and spirit. For Paul, the human body that's of dust and it perishes when you die. You can call it physical or call it whatever you want. But the new body, he calls a life-giving spirit. He uses the word pneuma, spirit. And it means that it's not of this world. It's of a higher origin. So that's a lengthy exposition of what I think Paul thought about resurrection. And he would not have been impressed at all with a resuscitated corpse. what would that prove about a new creation? That person's still going to die. You have to wonder in Matthew when he has physical resurrections, right? Think of it. This is just the craziest thing in Matthew. Even the most conservative evangelicals have trouble. I'm not going to name any names, but they're out there on YouTube like, well, maybe that's a metaphor. Well, it's not a metaphor to Matthew. I mean, read it. When Jesus dies, the tombs were open and people came out of the tombs and walked around and appeared to people. What are they going to look like? What are they going to look like? Well, if they've been dead 2 or 3 days, I guess they look almost the same. What if they've been dead a year? It's just, this idea of resuscitating corpses getting confused with Paul's view of resurrection. Paul's view of resurrection is a new creation and being turned into one of these sons of God, glorified. He calls Jesus the firstborn of many brothers and sisters, firstborn of this whole family of God.
And what do you think that Paul and his opponents were arguing over exactly? Like, what kind of details of the resurrection? What do you think his opponents believed about the resurrection in comparison and contrast to what Paul believed?
Okay, I don't think in his letters we have anybody coming and arguing what the later Gospels present. Remember, we're talking about the 50s. The Gospels could be the 70s, 80s, 90s, even later. So nobody in his lifetime was probably presenting anything different than what I just went over. I'm assuming that when he names Peter and James and the 12 and all the apostles and the 500, that they also saw a glorious manifestation of the resurrected Christ at the right hand of God with all his power and glory. That's what they saw. And Matthew would kind of indicate that, because if you remember, they're on a mountain and they see Jesus and then some doubt. It sounds more like what we call a epiphany or an apparition of some type that they're seeing. So in his lifetime, I don't think his opponents had a different view. I think this different view in the Gospels develops later for apologetic reasons. People begin to say, like Celsus did later, hey, come on, you might have seen a ghost, or maybe you were schizophrenic, or maybe it was in your head. You're telling me Jesus has been raised. I don't know what you saw. You don't even know what you saw, that kind of thing. And so they begin to develop this idea, no, he can't, the stone was rolled away. He came out, the tomb was empty. He showed his body to people. Now, Paul would probably say, well, that wouldn't be resurrection in terms of the transformation to an eternal life-giving spirit. That would just be, there are people raised from the dead in the Hebrew Bible, right? There's several. And that's not Christian resurrection. In the book of Maccabees, you have early mentions of resurrection. When Antiochus Epiphanes is torturing these poor Maccabean resistors with all kinds of horrible torture, second Maccabees, and it's very gruesome. I don't even want to talk about what he did to them. But what do they say? I will come back with new hands and with new arms and with, new limbs, even though you cut my limbs off and so forth. That view of resurrection is not Paul's view. So I don't know anybody in Paul's day that opposed him for his view of the resurrection. I think if they did, we'd have evidence of it. So I think Paul's view of resurrection, which I just described to you, is the earliest Christian view of resurrection, that he's been taken up to heaven. Of course, you leave the old clothing behind. Take the clothing analogy, it becomes ludicrous. Like, I lose my old rotten body, and now I'm naked, and I get raised in a new glorious body, and I go, oh, wait, where's my old clothes? I want to be sure and hold on to those. Why would you want to hold on to your old clothes, right? They're rotten, they're worn out, they're dirty, they're old, they're perishing. and now you have this new clothing of the Spirit. I do think Paul had opponents, of course, but I don't think it was over resurrection. So that might be something that would be new for you to think about. But if you compare him to the Gospels, then there's a difference. But his opponents in his own day, I think they were opposing him because of his position he was beginning to take. They were primarily Jewish opponents. He says, are they Jewish? So am I. Are they this? So am I. Are they Hebrew? So am I. It's mainly in 2nd Corinthians, some in 1st Corinthians. And they were opposing him on the basis of questioning his apostolic authority. And he will not stand for that. He would say, I actually have more authority than you because you only knew Jesus after the flesh. I don't think he was opposed early on, from what we can tell in Galatians. He does go up, he meets with James and Peter and John and the others. They seem to be on relatively good terms. But shortly after that, he has a big row with Peter in Antioch, where he denounces him to his face and says that he's not upright before God. And it probably has to do with him teaching that the Torah, with all of its interpretations of how to keep this and that commandment or mitzvah, that is all passing away, that male and female are passing away, that slave and free, that Jew and Gentile are all in the process of passing away because the world's undergoing this cosmic transformation. And so they are still looking for something, I think, more what we would probably call earthly. Like Paul says, for example, in Galatians, Jerusalem above is the mother of us all, not Jerusalem below. That should tell you right there something major. I would guess that James and Peter and John and all of the 12 would have believed in the kingdom of God on earth in Jerusalem. I'm talking the city of Jerusalem, and sitting on 12 thrones, judging the regathered tribes of Israel. That seems basic in the message of Jesus. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the good news. I think Paul saw the gospel as a cosmic message of salvation and transformation, escaping death and becoming one of these glorified beings, not let's go set up a kingdom in Jerusalem where we would have Christ sitting on a throne and the 12 apostles and all these people coming up. So if he did read Isaiah 2, which talks about the nations coming up to Jerusalem, I think he would have probably taken it more allegorically, that they're coming up to learn the gospel. But he thinks Jesus is coming very soon. He says, we who are alive and remain at the coming, the parousia, the Greek word, the appearance, he thinks it's coming in his lifetime. He thinks it's coming not when he's really old. He sounds like he thinks it's coming very soon. Tells people not to get married, don't go into business. If you're a slave, don't even worry about it. Very soon you'll be free. So he's not talking about setting up some kind of physical kingdom on earth in the present Jerusalem. He's talking about the Jerusalem above. So if you want to know Paul's view, it would be something like in some of the apocryphal literature or the book of Revelation. Read Revelation 21 and 22. That's more Paul's view. The first earth and heaven are passed away. Well, if they're passed away, we're not in Jerusalem sitting on thrones with people coming up, like you would videotape them today, as people are viewing the kingdom of God on earth and so forth. Now it is on earth, but it's a new earth. It's a new creation. So I think Revelation 21 and 22 is probably Paul's view. And then he says that the bride, Revelation says the bride of Christ will come down from heaven and dwell on earth, and the nations will learn the way of God and so forth. That's how he's interpreting the Hebrew prophets, not as this political, social order of this present age. He's talking about a transformed age to come. And I'm guessing that James and Peter and others believed in a more literal reading of those prophets. And with that, then, is the question of observing the Torah. Because if everything is passing away and there'll be no temple, the temple's the center of Jerusalem, and there'll be no sun and moon and stars because the Lamb is the light and God the Father comes down upon earth in his presence and so forth. It's so completely transformed. And I guess he has some view like that. I don't know, because Paul never tells us any details about what happens after the parousia, other than God is going to reconcile all to himself. That's all he ever says. Conquering death. He says death will be conquered and sin will be conquered and God will be all in all. So some kind of picture of cosmic harmony. But I don't think it has anything to do with this physical perishing world of sin and death any more than the body. But that would be a real bone of contention with people saying to Gentiles or to Jews, you know, all of these observances, either as applicable to the Gentiles, Acts 15, or to the Jews, the whole Torah, Paul thinks it's all passing away. So very soon there won't be male or female. There won't be slave and free. And there won't be rich and poor. And there won't be any of these distinctions of our culture, our society, and our world. Everything will be transformed. So he's kind of different on that, I think. And you get inklings of that as apocalypticism begins to wane, and you begin to see people talking more about the heavenly kingdom that's going to come rather than an earthly kingdom.
When do you think people came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? And when do you think they started having visions? Was it immediately after Jesus was crucified, around circa 30 CE, or a few years later than that? From the data that we do have from the epistles of Paul, when do you think this began?
If you go just by the epistles of Paul, it sounds like it's pretty immediate. Christ died and was buried, and on the third day rose and was seen. So sounds pretty immediate, even mentions the third day. So I would say that tradition is probably goes back, you know, he's solid with that. But probably, I really like the Gospel of Peter. If you read, I have it right here. I thought it might come up. I got a little excerpt from it that I can pull out. It's the very ending of the Gospel of Peter. It's the last two lines, and then it breaks off, unfortunately. This is after the tomb is found empty, okay? And they're told he's risen, just like Mark. And it says the women fled away. Now listen to this. Now it was the final day of unleavened bread. Okay, that's 7 days after Passover. Notice, 7 days later. Unleavened bread lasts 7 days, and the 8th day. So you got Passover and the days of unleavened bread. It was the final day of unleavened bread. So this is a week later. This is a bombshell text. In other words, nobody, according to this text, was running around Jerusalem during the first 7 days of the festival of Passover and unleavened bread, saying, he's risen, I saw him, and so forth. So this thing we have in Mark and in Matthew and Luke and John, this seems to be earlier, because I don't think the Gospel of Peter would say that we wept and cried for 7 days, and when the feast was over, we 12 disciples of the Lord were weeping and sorrowful. Why are they weeping and sorrowful if they've been meeting with him almost every day? They haven't seen him yet. Okay, then what happens? and we departed to our home. So they go back to the Galilee. They're from the Galilee. That's what you do when the festival is over. You come up to Jerusalem for the festival, and it's 8 days total. And after 8 days, you go back. We departed, each departed to his home. But I, Simon Peter, and my brother Andrew took our nets and went off to the sea. And there was with us Levi, son of Alphaeus, whom the Lord, and then it breaks off. Now think about that. That's like a thunderbolt. What that says is that all of this stuff about the first week, the Gospel of Peter doesn't even know about. And the text believes in resurrection. Unfortunately, it breaks off. So the best data I can come up with is he died, he was buried. On the third day, he rose, meaning he was glorified and ascended to heaven in this new state. Body left behind. Body left behind. There's no empty tomb. Nobody cares about tombs in Paul's view of resurrection. It's transformation from flesh to spirit. And then, once they're in Galilee, there's a sighting. And since Peter's mentioned, and he says, I'm going back fishing. Come on, Andrew, let's go home. And once Peter is mentioned, then you finally get some appearance to Peter. So was it a week later when they got back, a month later? But it does seem relatively quickly, or he would have said, and quite a while later, he appeared to Peter. He just says he appeared to Peter. And then James, and then the 12, and then the other apostles into 500. So I think they're all back in the Galilee. That's what you would expect. They're not in Jerusalem. So what gets them back in Jerusalem? The next festival. The next festival, they go back, right? They go back to Jerusalem because they're Jews and they're going to keep the day of Pentecost or Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. And they go back. And when they go back, they have this experience of, in Acts 2, whatever it was, of the Spirit of God coming upon the whole group and so forth. So the full extent of their experience was over that 50-day period. But I think the recovery of faith was in the Galilee. When I'm on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, I'm going to turn my camera here and show you. There's a painting on the wall right there. Do you see that painting? Right above the books there.
Yeah,
I
I
know
see
it's
that.
not up close, but it's a lake of the Galilee on the northern shore, right by the Arbel Cliffs. That's where they would be fishing. And I have that picture up to remind me that's the spot where people began to believe he's been exalted to the right hand of God. He's alive. Even though he was crucified, even though we buried him, he has been exalted. Now, remember at this time, this was believed of Moses, of Elijah, of Enoch, of other figures. Did you know Josephus says that Moses was transformed? Philo says Moses was transformed and taken to heaven, and yet still mentions a tomb of Moses. And so this idea of the corpse needing to come out of the tomb is something that's been developed for apologetic reasons, because Christian doubters and skeptics would say, well, if you're telling me something you saw in your head, or even 500 people saw, we have stories like that throughout history of all kinds of visions and apparitions. That's not solid evidence. And that was what the Gospels are addressing directly. But even Mark, notice Mark doesn't say that he appeared. So even the appearances come later, in Jerusalem. And of course, Matthew doesn't have any appearances in Jerusalem. He to the apostles, he puts everybody up north. So that would be my response to that. So I don't think there was controversy on resurrection for the first generation. I think there was a fervent belief that they had seen him. And I think to them, it was this absolutely concrete experience. And that's why I've never thought the Talpio tomb, even if it had the bones of Jesus, would say anything about the original resurrection faith, any more than somebody going to a tomb today of a Christian and believing that they've been departed to be with Christ, as Paul says in Philippians. They haven't got the new body yet, but Paul does talk about dying and departing to be with Christ. And so why are you interested in a tomb? A tomb is a dustbin. And many people now are cremated, so you don't even have a tomb. So that would be my answer.
And what do you think the relationship that exists between the Gospel of Peter and the Synoptics? Do you think one was familiar with the other, or do you think they're independent?
I tend to think that Peter knows Mark, or Mark knows Peter. I'm not sure. I would tend to give Mark priority. He does follow Mark in many ways, like the part I just read about. They found the tomb open. They came forward, bent down. There was a young man there, and he says, "Who do you seek?" He's risen and gone away, or gone up, as it can be translated. He's not here. Now, that could be in the presence of a corpse. Like, why do you seek the living among the dead? Like, he's living, he's not dead, he's gone. But I'm not sure. There are other things in the Gospel of Peter that seem to be very legendary. You remember how Jesus comes out of the tomb and he's as high as a skyscraper and all that kind of thing? That's his spiritual body getting described. It says his head reaches to the clouds of heaven. So again, it's not a corpse coming out. So